Hey, how's it going? This video is on biological organization and interactions. In preceding videos, we looked at the nature of living systems and the properties that living systems have that make them alive. We also looked a bit about regulation and the underlying logic that drives regulation in living systems and in many other systems as well. Now we're going to look at how biological systems are organized, and we're going to look at how they interact with each other, or how the components of those systems interact. So really all we're going to talk about in this video are, broad sense, those two things. The hierarchical structure of living things, and why interactions within and between living systems are really, really complex. By far the most complex systems that we know of in the universe are living systems. So that's really interesting and is a major focus of biology. It's important to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about how biology is structured hierarchically. What we mean is that each level of the system is due to the properties of the levels below it. And so you can see this here. We're going from atoms up through various levels of organization to individual organisms, and then from there all the way up to the entire Earth system. And each level in this diagram, and follow the arrows, comes about as a result of the interactions in the components in the level that comes before it. So for instance, molecules come about as a result of the interactions among atoms, and cells come about as the result of the interactions among molecules, etc. There are a couple of points here that I'm just gonna make as we talk here. The first is that I would say that this line right here is sort of the dividing line between non-living and living things. So anything that's atoms or molecules is traditionally considered to be non-living. And we talked about how in order to be alive, you need to be at least one cell big. And so we'll draw a line right there. Also understand that many organisms aren't made out of tissues or organs or organ systems. Those parts are very much just found in multicellular organisms, but we are going to look at them in this series of videos. So that's why we've put them here, and they absolutely do function this way. And then we start to bring in non-living things again over here, right? Instead of it being non-living and then living, over in these structures from the ecosystem on upwards, we've got living and non-living elements working together in these levels. So just a couple of things to keep in mind here. The other thing is that this idea that properties emerge as a result of interactions in the components one level below in the hierarchy is known as emergent properties, and this is definitely something that you will see in all sorts of systems, not just living systems. I always like to talk about your computer because it's probably really near you while you're watching these videos. Your computer, your cell phone, which is just a computer, that has emergent properties. Properties that the components that make it up do not have, but those properties come about as a result of the functioning between those components. Kind of neat and something to keep in mind. The other thing I wanted to talk about in this video is where the complexity that we see in biological systems comes from. Biological systems are by far the most complex systems that we know of in the universe, and that's really interesting. But what's also interesting is that that complexity doesn't come from anything particularly special. It just comes from math. So what I've done here is I have three different biological systems that I have modeled. We have some sort of boundary, and then we have components in there, and I've used some graphics of different animals to show the components. So in system 1, we have 2 components, an elephant and an aardvark. In system 2, we have 3 components. We've put in an agouti as well. And in system 4, we have a 4th component. Bonus points if you can figure out what that is. If we look at these systems, we see that the number of interactions that we can have among the components does something kind of interesting as the number of components increases. Let's work through it starting with system 1. And let's be clear, this is a very simplified model for the purpose of this explanation. And we're going to assume that interaction between component 1 and component 2, the anteater and the elephant, is different than the interaction between the elephant and the anteater. With that in mind, there are 2 different interactions in system 1. When we add an additional component to the system, notice that the number of interactions goes up, but it doesn't go up linearly. It's not like we increase the number of components and the number of interactions goes up by 1 or even doubles. It actually goes up exponentially. We now have 6 different interactions in our system. I'm sure you can figure them all out, but this is what they would look like. And then when we add an additional component to the system, in system 3, we now have 4 components, the number of interactions increases exponentially again. This is what we call combinatoriality. It's the idea that as we put more pieces into a system, the number of combinations is going to increase exponentially. By the time you got to a system with 10 components, there would be over 3.5 million different interactions that could happen among those components. Now consider a cell. An E. coli cell, a relatively non-complex cell, has 1 million components inside of it. Think about all of the numbers of interactions you can have if you have 1 million components interacting. I'll tell you that the number is incredibly large. It's not technically infinite, but for our purposes, we can think about it as functionally infinite. Now consider the number of interactions that happen inside of your body with 100 trillion cells, or in an ecosystem like a rainforest or something like that. That's where the complexity emerges from. It doesn't emerge from anything special. It just emerges from the mathematical relationships that come about as we have more and more components in a system. And of course, it's not unique to living systems. Any system where you increase the number of components will increase the number of interactions in this exponential fashion. As we wrap up this video, we just want to make sure that we have a handle on the following things. You want to make sure that you can describe the relationship and the connection between different levels of the biological hierarchy. How is it that cells come about as a result of the interactions from molecules? How is it that you get an organism as a result of the interactions among organ systems? We're going to talk a lot more about these things over our year together, but it's definitely the kind of thing that you need to be thinking about with this video. You also want to make sure that you can explain how living systems exhibit such remarkable complexity. If you have any questions about that, go back and look at our discussion of the previous slide and see if you can get a handle on it. If you can do these things, you're doing great. If not, that's okay too. Take a moment, pause the video, and write down any questions that you have so that you can get the help that you need. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.